James Whitaker stepped out of the glossy black sedan, the neon lights of the underground garage reflecting off his meticulously polished leather shoes. At 45, he was the epitome of success, a white American entrepreneur who had built a financial empire from scratch, now owning a shimmering glass tower in the heart of Chicago. The building with its 60 floors of steel and glass symbolized his power, where every decision was calculated with the precision of a machine's heartbeat. This morning, like every other, James arrived at his office on the top floor at exactly 7:45 a.m., earlier than most employees. He relished the silence of those early hours, when the city below was still yawning, and he could control everything within his reach. James's office was a minimalist yet commanding space. Floor-to-ceiling glass walls opened to a view of Chicago's skyline, where skyscrapers competed to pierce the heavens. His ebony desk, polished to a sheen, held only a laptop, a small framed photo of his mother, the woman who raised him in poverty, and a cup of espresso he rarely drank. His charcoal gray suit was impeccably tailored, the deep green silk tie knotted tightly, as if his meticulous appearance was a barrier between him and the outside world. James didn't live to enjoy. He lived to control. His schedule, meticulously entered by his assistant Clara into the system, was packed from 8 a.m. to 9 p.m. Meetings with shareholders reviewing financial reports and calls with partners in London. There was no room for error, no room for surprises. Clara, a woman in her 30s, with neatly tied blonde hair and perpetually vigilant eyes, was the only one who dared approach James when he was focused. She had worked for him for 5 years, long enough to know he disliked interruptions, but astute enough to sense when rules needed bending. This morning, she knocked on the door at 8:05, earlier than expected. "Mr. Whitaker." Her voice trembled slightly. "There's a situation." James looked up from his laptop screen, his brow furrowing. "A situation?" He repeated, his tone as cold as glass. Clara hesitated, holding a small piece of paper, her eyes wavering between confusion and concern. "There's a little girl who wants to see you. She says she needs to talk to you now." James's frown deepened. A little girl. He immediately thought of an employee's child, perhaps wandering into the building on a bring-your-kid-to-work day. But Clara shook her head, as if she couldn't understand it. "She's alone. No adults with her, and she's very insistent." James sighed, waving a hand. "Tell security to take her back to her parents. I don't have time for this." But before Clara could turn away, the heavy glass door swung open, and a small figure stepped inside. It was a black girl, no older than 6, wearing a slightly worn red sweater and a short denim skirt. Her white sneakers were scuffed, as if she had walked a long way. Her curly hair was loosely tied with a rubber band, a few strands falling over her forehead. She wore a tiny backpack, and in her small hands was a crumpled piece of paper. Her large brown eyes locked onto James's, fearless, despite his ability to silence an entire boardroom with a glance. Without waiting for an invitation, she walked to the desk, stood on tiptoe to place the paper on the polished wood, and said, her voice clear as an adult's, "I need a job." Silence enveloped the room. James, who had faced tough investors and billion-dollar mergers, felt caught in an inexplicable moment. He looked at the girl, then at Clara, who stood frozen by the door, her mouth slightly open as if wanting to speak, but unable to. The paper on the desk drew his attention. It was written in colored pencils, the handwriting shaky but careful. "I know how to clean. I'm quiet. I don't cry in front of people. I can learn." In the corner of the paper, red and blue stars were meticulously drawn, and next to the word "please" was a small, trembling heart. It was a résumé, the strangest résumé James had ever seen. He sat down, trying to maintain his usual composure, but something in the girl's eyes made it impossible to dismiss her. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice softer than intended. The girl stood tall, her backpack slipping slightly on her shoulder. "I'm Lila Jackson," she replied. "I'm 6 years old. I need a job to help my mom." James looked into her eyes, seeing a determination far beyond her years. He glanced at Clara, who had now stepped closer, her eyes full of worry. "Clara, call security," he said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. Lila shook her head, her small hands clenching tightly. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. "My mom is sick. I have to help her live." Lila's words cut through the armor of power James had built over the years like a sharp knife. He had heard pleas before from employees, partners, even family, but none had ever struck him like this. Perhaps it was the raw honesty of the girl, or the way she stood there, small but resolute, as if the entire world hinged on this moment. James looked at the paper again, his fingers brushing over the word, "Please." He didn't know why, but he felt compelled to do something. "How did you find me?" he asked, his voice softer still. Lila lifted her head, her eyes brightening. "My mom read about you in the paper. You're the one who fixes things. This building is the biggest I've ever seen, so I thought you could help." She pointed out the window where Chicago sprawled below a city of wealth and inequality. James followed her gesture, realizing for the first time that the world wasn't just numbers in his reports. He had grown up in poverty, in a cramped apartment on the city's south side, but he had long forgotten that feeling. Now a 6-year-old was reminding him. Clara, still standing near the door, spoke up, her voice quiet but clear. "Sir, I can take her to the waiting room, or—" James raised a hand, signaling her to stop. He looked at Lila, noticing her hands trembling slightly, though her face remained calm. "Where's your mom?" he asked. Lila answered immediately. "Mercy Clinic, room 12. She sleeps a lot, but I know she needs me." She paused and added, "She doesn't know I'm here. She wouldn't let me. But I had to do something." James stood towering in his suit, but for once, he didn't feel in control. He looked at Lila and Clara, who awaited his instructions with a questioning gaze. "Clara," he said, his voice low but firm, "cancel the 9 o'clock meeting. I'm going with this girl." Clara blinked, surprised. Sir James didn't explain. He grabbed his coat, stepped out from behind the desk, and turned to Lila. "Let's go," he said. "We're going to see your mom." Lila nodded, her backpack slipping as she followed him. As they left the office, Clara remained behind, watching them go. She said, "I've never seen him like this." Outside, the city of Chicago continued its frenetic pace. But at that moment, James Whitaker's world shifted in a direction he could never have anticipated. The office of James Whitaker, with its transparent glass walls and sweeping view of Chicago's skyline, had never felt so stifling as it did now. The crumpled piece of paper Lila Jackson had placed on the ebony desk dominated the room, drawing every gaze. James, who had reviewed hundreds of million-dollar contracts without blinking, now hesitated before a scrap of paper written in colored pencils. Lila, the 6-year-old black girl in a worn red sweater and scuffed sneakers, stood before the desk. Her small hands clenched, her large brown eyes fixed on him. Her voice, though soft, rang out like a declaration. "I need a job." Clara, James's assistant, lingered near the door, her hands clasped tightly, as if trying to contain her unease. She glanced at James, expecting a familiar command, perhaps to call security or escort the girl out, but James said nothing. He leaned down and picked up the paper, his fingers brushing lightly over the shaky handwriting. "I know how to clean. I'm quiet. I don't cry in front of people. I can learn." In the corner of the paper, red and blue stars were carefully drawn, and next to the word "please" was a small, trembling heart, its lines wavering as if Lila had poured all her courage into drawing it. This was a résumé, not the kind he'd seen in high-stakes hiring, but a plea written from the heart of a child. James sat down, placing the paper before him, and looked at Lila. She stood tall, her tiny backpack slipping slightly on her shoulder, but her gaze never wavered. Something in Lila's resolve made James a man who always controlled every situation feel unmoored. He had faced aggressive investors and underhanded competitors, but never a 6-year-old who dared walk into his office and demand a job. "Who are you, Lila?" he asked, his voice gentler than he intended, as if afraid to shatter the fragility of the moment. "I'm Lila Jackson," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm 6 years old. I live with my mom on 47th Street. But my mom is sick, and I have to help her." Lila paused, taking a deep breath, as if organizing the words she'd rehearsed in her mind. "My mom said you're a man with money. People with money can help when no one else can." Lila's words, though naive, were sharp as an arrow piercing the invisible armor James had built around himself. He looked at her, noticing her hands trembling slightly, yet her face maintained an uncanny calm, as if she was accustomed to being strong. James glanced at Clara, who had now stepped closer, her eyes filled with worry. "Clara, what do you know about this?" he asked, his tone low but tinged with curiosity. Clara shook her head, her voice soft. "I don't know, sir. She came into the building alone. Security said she insisted on seeing you. No one could stop her." Clara paused, then added, "She seems very serious." James nodded slightly, his gaze returning to Lila. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but he knew he couldn't send her away. Not out of pity, but because something in Lila's eyes, a mix of determination and desperation, compelled him to understand more. "Why do you think I can help?" James asked, leaning forward, his hands clasped on the desk. Lila took a step closer, standing on tiptoe, to be nearer, as if ensuring he heard every word. "My mom read about you in the paper," she said. "You fix things. This building is the biggest I've ever seen, and my mom said people like you can do big things. My mom, she can't work anymore. The hospital says it costs a lot of money and we don't have it." Lila paused, her eyes blinking rapidly, but no tears fell. "I didn't know what else to do, so I came here." James felt an invisible wave surge in his chest. Not pain, but a sensation he couldn't name. He had grown up in poverty in a cramped apartment on Chicago's South Side, where his mother worked double shifts to raise him and his sister. But he had buried those memories, turning them into fuel to climb to the pinnacle of power. Lila, a girl the same age he was when his mother began working herself to exhaustion, stood before him, carrying a story too similar to his past. But Lila wasn't asking for money. She was asking for a job, a concept alien to a child, yet imbued with pride and responsibility he couldn't ignore. He knelt, meeting Lila's eyes, an action he had never done with anyone in this room. "Where's your mom?" he asked, his voice soft like when he used to talk to his mother in days long past. Lila answered immediately. "Mercy Clinic, room 12. She sleeps a lot, but I know she needs me. Her name is Naomi." She paused, then added, her voice quieter. "She doesn't know I'm here. She wouldn't let me. But I had to do something." Lila's confession, though simple, struck like a hammer at the wall of indifference James had built around himself. He looked into her eyes, seeing an undeniable truth. Lila wasn't just fighting for her mother, but for her hope. James stood holding Lila's résumé in his hand, his fingers tracing the word, "please." He looked at Clara, who awaited his instructions with a questioning gaze. "Clara," he said, his voice low but firm, "get the car ready." I'm going with this girl. Clara blinked, surprised. Sir, you mean? James didn't explain. He turned back to Lila, seeing her adjust her backpack, her eyes brightening with a faint spark of hope. Are you sure you want me to come with you? He asked, though he already knew the answer. Lila nodded, her hands clenching tighter. I'm sure, she said. You're the only one I thought could help. As they left the office, Clara remained behind watching them go. She muttered to herself, what's happening to him? Outside, the city of Chicago continued its frenetic pace. Still at that moment, James Whitaker felt his world tilting, pulled along by a 6-year-old with a handwritten resume and a heart bigger than any contract he'd ever signed. He didn't know what awaited at Mercy Clinic, but knew he couldn't turn back. Not now. James Whitaker stepped out of his office, his cashmere overcoat draped over his arm, his leather shoes echoing steadily on the marble floor. Beside him was Lila Jackson, the 6-year-old black girl in a worn red sweater and a tiny backpack slipping off her shoulder. The sight of a powerful CEO walking side by side with a small child drew stares and whispers from employees in the Glass Tower's lobby in Chicago. James paid no attention. His focus was on Lila, who walked with a determination that belied her petite frame. She had just declared her need for a job to save her mother, and now somehow James found himself drawn into a story he hadn't prepared for. In the elevator, silence enveloped them, broken only by the soft hum of the motor as they descended from the 60th floor. James glanced at Lila, seeing her clutch the straps of her backpack, her large brown eyes fixed on the steel doors. Aren't you scared? He asked, his voice low, breaking the quiet. Lila looked up and shook her head. I don't have time to be scared, she replied, her voice small but firm. My mom needs me. Her words, though simple, pierced through the armor of detachment James had built over decades of conquering the financial world. He nodded, saying nothing more. But inside, an old memory flickered: his mother, a frail white woman, working herself to exhaustion to raise him in the dilapidated apartments of Chicago's South Side. He had long forgotten that feeling, but Lila was resurrecting it. When the elevator opened to the underground garage, James's driver, a middle-aged man named Harold, was waiting by the black sedan. Harold raised an eyebrow at the sight of Lila, but asked no questions, simply opening the back door for them. James gestured for Lila to get in first, then slid beside her. Mercy Clinic, he said to Harold, his tone curt. Harold nodded, but his eyes in the rearview mirror flicked to Lila, as if trying to piece together what was happening. Lila didn't notice. She sat upright, her backpack on her lap, her small hands clasped tightly. James looked at her, curious. How did you get to my building? He asked, unable to hide his surprise. Lila turned to him, her eyes brightening, as if she'd been waiting for the question. I walked, she said, from 47th Street. I know the way because my mom used to take me through there to buy bread. I saw your building. It's the tallest, the shiniest. I thought if you're there, you must be important. Lila paused, taking a deep breath. My mom read about you in the paper. Once she said you fix things like companies, buildings, everything. If you can fix big things, maybe you can fix my mom. Lila's explanation, though naive, carried a sharp logic that caught James off guard. He looked at her, realizing this journey wasn't random. Lila had planned it however a 6-year-old's mind could. You went alone? James asked, his voice gentle, though a storm churned within him. Lila nodded. My mom sleeps a lot. I left a note saying I would buy milk but came here instead. I took some change from my mom's jar to take the bus part way, then walked the rest. She paused, looking down at her scuffed sneakers. I knew she wouldn't let me, but I had to try. James felt a wave of emotion rise, not pity, but respect. Lila wasn't just brave. She had a will stronger than he'd seen in most adults in his boardrooms. From the driver's seat, Harold spoke up, his voice low. "This kid's got guts, sir. I've seen kids in my neighborhood, but none like her." James nodded slightly, his eyes still on Lila. He thought of 47th Street, a poor southwest Chicago neighborhood where cramped apartments and early shuttered shops were commonplace. He'd lived in a similar place once, but it was a past he'd tried to bury. Now Lila was pulling him back, not through memory, but through her actions. James pulled Lila's resume from his coat pocket and unfolded it. The shaky handwriting I know how to clean. I'm quiet. I don't cry in front of people, a reminder of Lila's pride. She wasn't asking for money or pity. She was asking for a chance to fight. "What's your mom's name?" he asked softly. "Naomi," Lila replied. "Naomi Jackson. She used to be a nurse, but she can't work anymore. The hospital says it costs a lot of money and we don't have it." Lila paused, her eyes blinking rapidly, but no tears fell. "I make dinner for her, but she doesn't eat much. I thought if I get a job, I can pay for the hospital." James felt his throat tighten. He knew of Mercy Clinic, an old public hospital, where uninsured patients often faced long waits or were denied advanced care. He'd donated to private hospitals through his company's charity fund, but those were just numbers on paper tax deductions. Lila's story was turning those numbers into a face, a name, a life. He looked out the window, watching Chicago's streets pass by the gleaming skyscrapers, the poor neighborhoods tucked in their shadows. The city's inequality, which he'd once ignored, now stood stark through Lila's eyes. "Lila," he said, turning back to her, "you're courageous for coming to me. But why did you think I'd help?" Lila looked up, her gaze unwavering. "Because my mom said people like you can do big things. I don't know anyone else. I only had you." Her words, though simple, felt like a verdict, forcing James to confront himself. He wasn't a hero, not a philanthropist. He was a businessman, living for profit and control. But now a 6-year-old was placing her faith in him, and he didn't know how to refuse. The car pulled up in front of Mercy Clinic, a gray building with small windows and a faded sign. Lila hopped out, her backpack slipping, then turned to wait for James. Before closing the car door, Harold said quietly to James, "This kid reminds me of my daughter. If you help her, you won't regret it." James nodded, not responding, but Harold's words stirred a new sense of responsibility. He stepped out, standing beside Lila, feeling the contrast between his expensive suit and the grim atmosphere of the public hospital. Lila grabbed the edge of his coat, not out of fear, but as if to ensure he wouldn't turn away. "Room 12, she said. "My mom's there." James took a deep breath, his heart beating faster. He didn't know what awaited in room 12, but he knew that everything had changed from the moment Lila stepped into his office. He looked down at her, seeing her eyes shine with hope, and realized he wasn't just accompanying Lila. He was stepping into a journey he hadn't prepared for, one that would force him to confront parts of himself he'd long tried to forget. The glass door of Mercy Clinic creaked as James Whitaker pushed it open, stepping into a space filled with the smell of antiseptic and pale fluorescent light. Beside him, Lila Jackson, the 6-year-old black girl in a worn red sweater and tiny backpack, moved swiftly, as if she knew every tile on the floor by heart. With its peeling walls and narrow corridors, this aging building was the world Lila had lived in for months. But for James, it was a shock. Accustomed to luxurious boardrooms and gleaming private hospitals, he felt out of place in this space, where poverty and desperation seemed to seep into every breath. Lila led the way, her scuffed sneakers making soft sounds on the tiled floor. James followed, his charcoal gray suit and cashmere coat making him stand out among the weary patients and medical staff. At the reception desk, a middle-aged nurse taking notes looked up as they approached. "Lila, "You're back." The woman whose name tag read Ruth said, her voice warm but tinged with concern. She glanced at James, her eyes flickering with surprise. "And this is—" Lila didn't let Ruth finish. "This is Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice clear. "He's here to help my mom." Ruth blinked, studying James to determine if he was truly the person Lila trusted. James gave a slight nod, not explaining. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but Lila's resolute gaze kept him from turning back. "Room 12, right?" Ruth asked, though she knew the answer. Lila nodded, then grabbed the edge of James's coat, pulling him along. The hallway to room 12 was long and dim, its white walls yellowed with age, the steady hum of machines emanating from other rooms. James felt the weight of this place, not just the smell of medicine or the weak lighting, but the sense of lives quietly fighting, forgotten by a system without enough resources to care for them. In his company's charity reports, he'd heard of public hospitals like Mercy Clinic, but this was the first time he'd stepped inside one. Lila stopped at the door to room 12, her small hand on the handle. She turned to James, her eyes showing a hint of hesitation for the first time since entering his office. "My mom sleeps a lot," she said softly. "Sometimes she doesn't hear me, but she's here." James nodded, feeling a wave of emotion rise. He placed a hand on Lila's shoulder, gentle but firm. "Let's go in," he said. Lila took a deep breath, pushed the door open, and stepped inside. The small room was bathed in dim light from a window covered by thin curtains. A hospital bed dominated the space, and on it lay Naomi Jackson, Lila's mother. Naomi was motionless, her dark skin pale and glistening with sweat under the lamp. IV tubes and machine wires wrapped around her, connected to a monitor beeping steadily. Her curly hair was loosely tied, a few strands falling onto the pillow. Though frail, her face retained a serene beauty, as if an inner strength still quietly resisted her illness. James stood silently at the foot of the bed, feeling Naomi's presence despite her sleep. Something about her, a quiet resilience, held his gaze. Lila approached the bed, setting her backpack on a chair and taking her mother's hand. "Mom," she whispered, her voice gentle but precise. "I brought someone to help you. This is Mr. Whitaker." Naomi didn't respond, but her fingers twitched slightly, as if she sensed her daughter's presence somewhere in her sleep. Lila turned to James, her eyes seeming to say, "See, she's still here." James stepped closer, pulling Lila's résumé from his coat pocket and placing it beside an untouched glass of water on the bedside table. The small act felt like a promise, not just to Lila, but to Naomi. Ruth, who had quietly followed them into the room, stood near the door watching. She spoke lowly. "Naomi was one of the best nurses we ever had. She worked here for 3 years, always staying late to care for patients. No one thought it would get this bad when she got sick." James turned to Ruth, his gaze sharp but curious. "What's wrong with her?" he asked. Ruth sighed, glancing at Lila to ensure she wasn't listening. "Lung cancer, late stage. We've done all we can, but without insurance and Mercy's limited resources, we can't offer advanced treatments. Naomi, she doesn't have much time unless a miracle happens." Ruth's words cut like a knife, not just for their harsh truth, but because Lila, at only 6, seemed to grasp it. She held her mother's hand, her eyes never leaving Naomi's face. James felt his throat tighten. He looked at Naomi, seeing the features of someone who had once been strong, who had sacrificed, now trapped in a frail body. He thought of his mother, who had worked herself to exhaustion to raise him, and realized Naomi, though a stranger, carried a similar strength. But Naomi had no one, like he'd had his mother, no one to fight for her, except Lila. James knelt beside Lila, meeting her eyes. "You come here daily, don't you?" he asked. Lila nodded. "I tell her stories, sing to her, even if she doesn't answer. I think she hears me." She paused and added, "She used to sing to me when I feared thunder. She said if I sang, everything would be okay." James gave a faint smile, though his heart was heavy. He looked at Naomi, imagining her in healthier days. A mother, a nurse, a woman who had devoted her life to caring for others. And now she lay here abandoned by the system. Ruth stepped closer, placing a hand on Lila's shoulder. "This girl has never cried in front of us," she said to James, her voice full of respect. "She's stronger than most adults I know." James nodded, his gaze returning to Naomi. He thought of the private hospitals his company funded, places with cutting-edge machines, top doctors, and bright rooms. The contrast with Mercy Clinic made him feel an injustice he'd never noticed. He'd once believed his money could solve anything, but now he saw money alone wasn't enough. It needed action and care. James stood, pulling out his phone and turning to Ruth. "I need to speak with Naomi's doctor," he said, his voice low but resolute. Ruth nodded, leaving to fetch the doctor. Lila looked at James, her eyes bright with hope. "You'll help my mom, right?" she asked. James didn't promise the impossible, but he touched her shoulder, his voice firm. "I'll do everything I can." Lila nodded, then returned to her mother's hand, as if James's words were enough to keep her faith alive. When Ruth returned with a young doctor, James stepped into the hallway to talk. The doctor explained that Naomi needed intensive treatment, but Mercy Clinic lacked the equipment and budget. If she were transferred to a hospital like St. Luke's with a specialized team, she'd have a chance, the doctor said. James nodded, his mind racing. He called his physician, requesting an immediate review of Naomi's case. Then he called his legal team, instructing them to prepare emergency funding to transfer Naomi to a better facility. Returning to the room, he saw Lila singing softly a children's song about rain and rainbows. Naomi still slept, but James felt that somewhere in her dreams she knew her daughter was fighting. James stood at the foot of the bed, watching Lila and Naomi, and realized this moment wasn't just about helping a stranger's family. It was about confronting himself, the parts he'd buried in his pursuit of power. Lila had brought him here, not just to save her mother, but to save a part of him. And as he looked at Lila's resume on the table, he knew he couldn't turn back. The fluorescent lights flickered in the hallway of Mercy Clinic, where James Whitaker stood, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low and resolute. Across from him was the young doctor in charge of Naomi Jackson, who had just explained her late-stage lung cancer with a weary but sincere expression. Lila Jackson, the 6-year-old black girl in a red sweater, remained in room 12, holding her mother's hand and softly singing a children's song about rainbows. James glanced through the glass door, seeing Lila's small figure by Naomi's bedside, and felt an unfamiliar urge, not pity, but a responsibility he'd never known. He who had orchestrated billion-dollar deals without flinching was now fighting for a life he hadn't known existed a few hours ago. Dr. Hargrove, James said into the phone, reaching his physician, "I need you to review the file of a patient named Naomi Jackson immediately. Lung cancer, late stage. I want her transferred to St. Luke's within 24 hours. Send your best team." His tone left no room for hesitation. On the other end, Hargrove, a seasoned doctor accustomed to James's urgent requests, agreed promptly. James hung up and turned to the Mercy Clinic doctor. "Where's Naomi's file?" he asked. The doctor nodded, hurrying to retrieve the documents, his eyes betraying astonishment at the man's determination in the expensive suit. Ruth, the middle-aged nurse who had worked with Naomi, stood nearby, watching James with curiosity and respect. "You're not like most people who come here," she said, her voice low. "Most just send money or make promises, then disappear." James met Ruth's gaze, recognizing the sincerity in her words. I'm not here to make promises, he replied. I'm here for Lila. Ruth gave a faint smile, but her eyes remained worried. That girl has carried the world since Naomi fell ill. I've never seen a child like her. James nodded, his gaze returning to Lila through the glass. He thought of her handwritten resume. I know how to clean. I'm quiet. I don't cry in front of people. I realized Lila wasn't just saving her mother. She was keeping him. James made another call, this time to his legal team. I need an emergency fund. He told the head of the team, his voice cold but sharp. Medical expenses for Naomi Jackson. No cap. Draft a contract with St. Luke's for her transfer today. I want this handled in hours. Though used to James's urgent demands, the person on the other end hesitated. Sir, this requires board approval. James cut them off. I am the board. Do it. He hung up, his pulse pounding, not from stress, but from a vitality he hadn't felt in boardrooms or major deals. When the doctor returned with Naomi's file, James skimmed the pages, noting key details. Stage 4, lung cancer metastasized, immunotherapy, halted due to lack of funds. He looked at Ruth and asked, How long have you known Naomi? Ruth nodded, her eyes distant. 3 years. She was a nurse here, always working overtime and caring for patients no one else noticed. She told me once that being a nurse was her way of giving back to life, because her mother died of cancer when Naomi was young. When she got sick, no one thought she'd last this long. But Lila's why she's still fighting. James listened deeply, respecting Naomi, though he'd never spoken to her. He stepped into room 12, where Lila sat by her mother. Naomi lay still, her dark skin pale, her breathing faint but steady with the help of machines. Lila looked up as James approached, her eyes bright with hope. Did you talk to the doctor? She asked. James knelt, meeting her gaze. Yes, he said. I'm arranging for your mom to go to a better hospital with great doctors and modern machines. Lila blinked as if trying to process his words. She'll get better, right? She asked, her voice small but full of longing. James didn't promise the impossible. We'll give her the best chance, he replied, touching her shoulder. Lila nodded, then returned to her mother's hand, as if James's words were enough to keep her faith alive. Clara, James's assistant, called from the office, her voice anxious. Sir, the shareholder meeting at 11. I canceled it, but they're demanding to see you. What should I say? James sighed, looking at Lila and Naomi. Say I'm busy, he replied. Redirect everything to the deputy director. I'm not leaving here today. Clara hesitated. Sir, I've never seen you like this. James gave a rare, faint smile. Neither have I, Clara. He hung up, feeling an unfamiliar freedom, as if he'd escaped an invisible cage. Ruth entered the room, bringing a cup of water for Lila. Drink this, sweetheart, she said gently. Lila took the cup, but her eyes stayed on her mother. Ruth turned to James, speaking softly. Mercy Clinic has seen too many, like Naomi, people without insurance, with no one to fight for them. This system isn't built for them. If you pull off what you're doing, you're not just saving Naomi. You're allowing Lila to believe the world still has justice. Ruth's words, though gentle, were a reminder of the injustices James had once ignored. He'd thought his money was the answer to every problem, but now he saw it was just a tool. What Lila needed, and what Naomi deserved, was presence and action. James looked at Naomi, seeing the features of a woman who had once been strong and sacrificed her life to care for others. He thought of his mother, who had worked herself to exhaustion to raise him, and realized Naomi, though lying here, carried a similar strength. He didn't know if he could save her, but he knew he had to try. Not for fame or duty, but because Lila had chosen him, a stranger, in a glass tower to place her trust in. He stepped into the hallway for another call, this time to the director of St. Luke's, a top private hospital his company funded. I want a private room for Naomi Jackson, he said. Best team, Best equipment. I'll cover everything." The director agreed immediately, and James felt a surge of energy. Returning to the room, he saw Lila drawing a simple sketch of 3 figures on a scrap of paper: a girl, a woman, and a man in a suit. "This is us," Lila said, handing it to James. He took it, his heart pounding. "It is," he replied, his voice low. "Us." James sat beside Lila, looking at Naomi in the dim light. He didn't know what would happen next, but knew he couldn't leave. Not today. Not tomorrow. Lila had pulled him into her story, and now he was part of it, not just a helper, but someone who stayed. Morning light streamed through the large windows of St. Luke's Hospital, where Naomi Jackson had been transferred just hours after James Whitaker's directive. The bright room with pristine white walls and modern medical equipment, humming steadily, starkly contrasted with the gloom of Mercy Clinic. Naomi lay on the bed, still deep in a medicated sleep, but her breathing was steadier, and her face, though pale, seemed less strained. Beside the bed, Lila Jackson, the 6-year-old black girl in her now clean red sweater, sat in an armchair, her small legs swinging above the floor. She held a piece of paper, scribbling with colored pencils, her eyes occasionally flicking to her mother. James Whitaker entered the room carrying a paper bag from a nearby bakery. The scent of fresh bread and hot cocoa wafted out, catching Lila's attention immediately. "Do you like cocoa?" James asked, his voice low, but carrying a gentleness he hadn't known he possessed. Lila nodded, her eyes brightening. "Mom used to make cocoa for me in winter," she said, taking the paper cup from James's hand. "She said it makes everything warmer." James smiled, setting the bag of pastries on the table beside Naomi's bed. He sat in the chair across from Lila, realizing for the first time that he wasn't rushing to return to his office. Meetings, reports, and emails, once the pillars of his life, now felt distant. Lila took a sip of cocoa and then pointed to her drawing. "This is Mom," she said, indicating a figure with long curly hair. "And this is me." A small girl with a big smile stood beside the woman. James leaned in, studying it closely. "It's beautiful," he said. "Do you draw your mom a lot?" Lila nodded. "I draw so she remembers. Mom said if I keep beautiful things in my head, she'll see them even when sleeping." Lila's words, though innocent, held a wisdom that silenced James. He looked at Naomi, imagining her in healthier days, a mother who taught her daughter to find light in the darkness. "Want to tell me about your mom?" James asked softly. Lila set the cocoa down, her eyes lighting up. "Mom was a nurse," she began. "She worked at the hospital, taking care of sick people. She sang so well, especially when I was scared of thunder. She said she wanted to be an artist but had to be a nurse to make money. She drew with me on weekends on old paper." Lila paused, looking at her mother. "She doesn't draw anymore since she got sick." James listened, feeling a connection to Naomi, though he'd never spoken to her. He thought of his mother, who had sacrificed her dreams to raise him, and realized Naomi, like her, had poured her life into her daughter. Ruth, the nurse from Mercy Clinic, appeared at the door, carrying a tray of medical supplies. She had requested a shift change to St. Luke's to continue caring for Naomi, a decision that surprised but touched James. "I couldn't leave Lila and Naomi alone," Ruth said as she checked the machines. "Naomi's special. She used to stay late to comfort patients with no family. She deserves someone fighting for her." James nodded, his gaze shifting to Lila, who was adding a star to her drawing. "She's got that," he said. Ruth smiled. "And now she's got you." James looked at Ruth, realizing she was more than a nurse. She was part of this story, someone who understood the injustices Naomi and Lila faced. "This healthcare system," Ruth said, her voice low, It's not built for people like Naomi. No insurance, no family. They get left behind. I've seen too many cases like this. Ruth's words reminded James of his company's charitable donations numbers he approved without thinking of the faces behind them. Naomi and Lila's faces were changing how he saw the world. He turned back to Lila, noticing she'd added another figure to her drawing, a tall man in a suit. "This is you," Lila said, handing the picture to James. He took it, his fingers tracing the clumsy but meaningful lines. 3 figures. Naomi, Lila, and him stood under sunlight holding hands. "We're a team, right?" Lila asked, her eyes shining with hope. James felt his throat tighten. He wasn't used to moments like this, but he nodded. "Yes, Lila," he said. "We're a team." Clara, his assistant, called from the office, her voice anxious. "Sir, the shareholders are demanding an emergency meeting. They say canceling today's meetings is unusual." James sighed, looking at Lila, who was starting a new drawing. "Clara," he said, "tell them I'm handling something more important. Redirect everything to the deputy director. I'll be here all day." Clara hesitated. "Sir, I don't understand. Are you okay?" James gave a faint smile. "I'm fine, Clara. Better than ever." He hung up, feeling a freedom he'd never known. The pressures of the financial world, once the core of his existence, now seemed dim compared to Lila's gaze. Ruth, after finishing her checks, sat beside Lila. "Want me to read a story to your mom?" she asked. Lila nodded, pulling a thin book from her backpack. Ruth began reading, her voice warm, about a rabbit finding its way home. James listened, realizing these moments, simple, sincere, were what he'd missed. He thought of his childhood when his mother read to him on the cold floor of their rundown apartment. At just 6, Lila was teaching him how to relive those moments. When Ruth left, James sat beside Lila, looking at Naomi. "Are you scared?" he asked softly. Lila shook her head. "I'm scared, but Mom said if I'm scared, I just have to do something. I did. I found you." James smiled, feeling deep respect for the girl. "You did great," he said. Lila looked at him, then asked, "You'll stay with us, right?" James didn't hesitate. "I'll stay," he replied. "Not just today." Lila handed him the drawing, and he folded it carefully, tucking it into his coat pocket. He looked at Naomi, a stray curl falling on her pillow, and felt an invisible bond with her. He didn't know if she'd wake, but he knew for Lila he'd do everything possible. As sunlight poured through the window, brightening the room, James realized he wasn't just helping a stranger's family. He was reclaiming a part of himself buried beneath glass towers and billion-dollar deals. The midday light filtered through the large windows of St. Luke's Hospital, casting a soft golden glow over Naomi Jackson's room. With its pristine white walls and modern medical equipment, the space exuded a sense of hope that Mercy Clinic could never offer. Naomi lay in bed, her dark skin, once pale now, showing a faint flush of color, though she remained frail. The IV tubes and machines around her hummed steadily, a quiet reminder of the battle she was silently fighting. Beside the bed, Lila Jackson, the 6-year-old black girl in her red sweater, sat in a chair, her small hands tightly clasping her mother's. She had just finished telling a story about a rabbit finding its way home, her eyes brightening each time she looked at Naomi, as if her voice alone could pull her mother back. James Whitaker stood in the corner of the room, hands in his suit pockets, his gaze fixed on Naomi. 3 days had passed since Lila walked into his office, and in those 3 days, he had changed more than he ever thought possible. Meetings, emails, and deals that once consumed his life now gave way to moments like this, standing in a hospital room, listening to a 6-year-old song, and waiting for a woman he'd never spoken to wake up. James wasn't sure what kept him here, but he felt an undeniable responsibility each time he looked at Lila. And each time he looked at Naomi, he sensed an invisible connection, as if she were part of a story he hadn't known he needed. Ruth, the nurse from Mercy Clinic, now working at St. Luke's, entered with a tray of medical supplies. She checked the monitor, jotted down notes, and then looked at Lila with a gentle smile. "You tell great stories," Ruth said, ruffling the girl's hair. Lila smiled, but her eyes stayed on her mother. Ruth turned to James, her voice low. "The doctors say Naomi's showing improvement. She might wake up today." James nodded, his heart quickening. He had arranged everything, transferring Naomi to St. Luke's, securing the best medical team covering all costs. But the thought of Naomi waking filled him with hope and apprehension. He wanted to see her open her eyes, not just for Lila, but because he longed to know who this woman was. Lila, sensing a shift in the air, stopped singing. She leaned in, whispering to her mother, "Mom, I'm here. Mr. Whitaker's here too. He's nice, you'll like him." James overheard a faint smile crossing his lips. He stepped closer, sitting beside Lila at her level. "You think your mom will like me?" he asked, his tone lightly teasing. Lila nodded, her expression serious. "Mom likes people who help others. You helped her, so she'll like you." Lila's words, though innocent, warmed James in an unfamiliar way. He looked at Naomi, imagining her voice and smile, and realized he anticipated meeting her more than he'd expected. Suddenly, Naomi's fingers twitched in Lila's grasp. The girl gasped, her eyes widening. "Mom!" Lila cried, her voice trembling. James shot to his feet, his pulse racing. Naomi's eyes fluttered slowly, her deep brown gaze opening hazy at first, then gradually focusing. She looked at Lila, and a faint smile curved her lips. "Sweetheart," Naomi whispered, her voice hoarse and faint, but filled with love. Lila burst into tears the first time James had seen her cry. She hugged her mother's arm, pressing her cheek to Naomi's palm. "You're awake." "I knew you'd wake up," Lila said, her voice choked. Ruth quickly called for the doctor, and within minutes, the room buzzed with activity. A doctor and 2 nurses checked the monitors, measured Naomi's pulse, and adjusted her medication. James stepped back, giving them space, but his eyes never left Naomi. When the doctor left, confirming Naomi was stable and could speak briefly, Lila stayed by her mother, eagerly recounting recent events. "I went to Mr. Whitaker's office," she said, her voice radiant. "I brought him to see you. He made everything better." Naomi listened, her hazy gaze shifting to James, who stood at the foot of the bed. "Who are you?" Naomi asked, her voice weak but clear, her eyes full of curiosity and gratitude. James stepped forward, suddenly feeling awkward in his expensive suit. "I'm James Whitaker," he said, his voice low. "I'm here because of your daughter, Lila. She changed everything." Naomi looked at him, then Lila, and another faint smile touched her lips. "Thank you," she whispered, squeezing Lila's hand tighter. "I don't know how to repay you." James shook his head. "You don't need to. Lila's done enough." Ruth, standing near the door, watched with glistening eyes. "Naomi, you had us worried," she said, her tone lightly teasing. "But this girl never gave up." Naomi looked at Lila, her eyes filled with pride. "You're my strength," she said, her voice breaking. Lila smiled, wiping her tears. "You're my strength too," she replied. James listened, feeling a deep respect for both mother and daughter. He thought of his lonely years building a financial empire to escape a poor past, and realized Naomi and Lila, despite having nothing, possessed something he never had: unconditional love. Naomi turned to James, her eyes brighter, despite her frail body. "Lila says you're kind," she said softly. "I trust her." James smiled, sensing an odd connection with Naomi. Something about her gentleness mixed with resilience made him want to stay to learn more about her. "She said you're a nurse," he said. "You must be special to a lot of people." Naomi nodded slightly, her gaze distant. "I just wanted to help others like my mom did. But when I got sick, I thought I'd lost everything, except Lila." She looked at her daughter, and James saw a spark in her eyes, a spark he wanted to preserve forever. Ruth stepped closer, rechecking the monitor. "Naomi, you need rest," she said gently. "But I know you won't listen." Naomi smiled faintly. "I've slept enough," she replied. James looked at Ruth, grateful for her dedication. "You stayed for Naomi, didn't you?" he asked. Ruth nodded. "She stayed for me when I lost my mom. I owe her." Ruth's words made James realize Naomi wasn't just a patient. She had touched many lives, and now she was touching his. As Lila began drawing a new picture, Naomi looked at James, her gaze carrying a sincerity that caught him off guard. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, "but you did, and I feel hope for the first time in so long." James leaned in, his voice low. "Lila gave me a reason to do it. And you make me want to keep going." His words, though simple, carried profound meaning. He felt a stirring in his heart, a feeling he'd never known, not pity, but admiration, and perhaps something more. The room fell silent, save for the steady beeps of the machines and Lila's pencil scratching on paper. James stood there watching Naomi and Lila and realized this moment wasn't just about saving a life. It was about finding a reason to live, not in glass towers or billion-dollar deals, but in simple, genuine connections. Naomi had woken, and with her, a part of James was awakening too. The afternoon light faded through the large windows of St. Luke's Hospital, casting a warm orange glow over Naomi Jackson's room. The space, with its modern medical equipment and pristine cleanliness, was a testament to the change James Whitaker had brought about in just a few days. Naomi, though still weak, was awake, her deep brown eyes brighter, holding a spark of hope that Lila, her 6-year-old daughter, tirelessly nurtured. Lila sat on the bed beside her mother, carefully folding a piece of paper into a crane, her eyes sparkling whenever Naomi smiled. James stood near the door, hands in his suit pockets, watching the mother and daughter with a feeling both unfamiliar and familiar. He who had lived in a world of numbers and power now found himself drawn into a story simpler, yet more profound than any deal he'd ever closed. Naomi, awake for just a day, was starting to speak more. Her voice was faint but unmistakable, carrying a gentleness that held James's attention. "Lila told me about how she went to your office," Naomi said, her gaze shifting to James, a mix of embarrassment and sincerity. "I don't know how to thank you. She's too young to do things like that." Lila, hearing her name, looked up from her paper crane. "I had to." "Mom," she said, her voice serious. "Mr. Whitaker fixes things, and I knew he'd help." James smiled, feeling the warmth spread through his chest. He stepped closer, sitting in the chair by the bed. "Lila's the bravest person I've ever met," he said, looking at the girl. "She made me rethink a lot of things." Naomi studied James, her eyes holding deep curiosity. "You're not what I imagined someone like you would be," she said. "I read about you in the papers, the man who built an empire, who never stops. But you're here with us." James shook his head, his voice low. "I'm no hero, Naomi. I couldn't turn away when Lila walked into my office." Naomi gave a weak smile, and in that moment, James felt an invisible connection between them, not just gratitude, but a mutual understanding, as if they both carried scars from pasts they hadn't yet shared. Ruth, the nurse from Mercy Clinic, entered with a tray of medications. She had become an integral part of this story for her dedication to Naomi and the sense of safety she brought Lila. "Naomi, you're looking better already," Ruth said, her tone lightly teasing. "But don't try talking too much, okay?" Naomi laughed a smile that lit up the room. "I've slept long enough, Ruth," she replied. Ruth turned to James, her eyes conveying respect. "Mr. Whitaker, I have to say, you've done what many here only dream of. Getting Naomi to St. Luke's. That's a miracle." James shook his head. "Not a miracle. Just what needed to be done." But Ruth wasn't satisfied with that. "You don't get it," she said, her voice low. "At Mercy Clinic, we see people like Naomi every day. No insurance. No one fighting for them. This system crushes them. I've seen families fall apart because they couldn't pay hospital bills. You gave Naomi and Lila a chance, but how many others don't have someone like you?" Ruth's words, though, gentle, cut like a knife, forcing James to confront a reality he'd once ignored. He'd thought his company's charitable donations were enough, but now he saw they were mere drops in an ocean of injustice. James stepped into the hallway to meet Marcus, a social worker assigned by the hospital to assist Naomi and Lila's case. Marcus, a middle-aged black man with a pensive gaze, sat across from James in a small meeting room. "I've reviewed the file," Marcus began, his voice steady. "Naomi's a textbook case of this healthcare system. She was a nurse and worked tirelessly, but when she got sick, no one helped her. She and Lila were pushed into a corner without insurance or family. Without you, I'm not sure where they'd be." James listened, angry not at Marcus, but at the system he'd been part of. "Do you have a story to share?" James asked, curious about the sincerity in Marcus's voice. Marcus sighed, his eyes distant. "My mother had cancer 10 years ago. We had no money, no one like you. She died in a public hospital in a room just like Naomi's at Mercy Clinic. I became a social worker because I wanted to help people like my mom. But sometimes, I feel like I'm fighting a machine too big." Marcus's words struck James, reminding him of his mother, who had exhausted herself to raise him. He'd fled his impoverished past, but Naomi, Lila, and Marcus were pulling him back, forcing him to face what he'd overlooked. James returned to the room where Lila was teaching Naomi to fold a paper crane. Naomi, though weak, followed along, her eyes lighting up whenever Lila laughed. James sat watching them and realized Naomi wasn't just a patient. She was a woman who had devoted her life to caring for others, and now she deserved care. He felt deep admiration for her, and something more, a gentle stirring he wasn't ready to name. When Lila ran out to get more paper from a nurse, Naomi looked at James, her gaze soft but firm. "You've given us hope," she said. "Not just to live, but to feel we're not forgotten." James leaned forward in a low voice. "You and Lila made me remember things I thought I'd lost. I'm not just here to help. I'm here because I want to be." Naomi smiled, and James felt his heart beat faster at that moment. Her resilience, gentleness, and sincerity made him want to stay, not just for Lila, but for her. He thought of his lonely years, building an empire to hide his pain, and realized Naomi, though battling illness, held a strength he craved. Ruth entered, bringing a glass of water for Naomi. "Where's the little one?" she asked, looking around. "Ran off for paper," Naomi replied, her voice tinged with amusement. Ruth turned to James. "You know, Naomi used to draw beautifully. She had a notebook full of sketches but stopped when Lila was born. Maybe you should encourage her to draw again." James nodded, his gaze returning to Naomi. "I will," he said, and Naomi smiled a smile that made the world feel brighter. When Lila returned, she carried a new drawing, Three figures standing in sunlight, holding hands. "This is us," Lila said, handing it to James. He took it, feeling a greater responsibility for Naomi and Lila and others abandoned by the system. Seeing Chicago sprawl below, he looked out the window and realized this story wasn't just about saving one family. It was about changing himself and perhaps a piece of the world. The evening at St. Luke's Hospital carried a gentle stillness as the neon lights of Chicago flickered through the large windows. In Naomi Jackson's room, the atmosphere was warmed by Lila Jackson's paper drawings taped to the walls, simple images of sunshine trees, and three people holding hands. Naomi, though still weak, could sit up slightly. Her curly black hair neatly tied her deep brown eyes, alight with newfound vitality. Lila, the 6-year-old black girl in her red sweater, was curled up in an armchair, fast asleep, after a day of storytelling and drawing for her mother. An open children's book rested on her lap, showing a rabbit running under moonlight. James Whitaker sat beside Naomi's bed, his suit jacket off and draped over the chair's back, looking at ease in this space for the first time. 3 days ago, he was a CEO, living in a world of power and control. But now he felt he belonged in this room, where Lila's laughter and Naomi's gentle voice were the most precious sounds. He looked at Naomi watching her fiddle with the paper crane Lila had folded and felt a stirring in his heart. Not just admiration, but something more profound, a feeling he wasn't ready to name. Naomi looked up, catching James's gaze, and smiled softly. "You're looking at me like I'm a puzzle," she said, her voice hoarse, but tinged with playfulness. James chuckled, a rare smile softening the stern lines of his face. "Maybe you are," he replied, leaning forward. "I've never met anyone like you, Naomi. You've been through so much, but you're still here, stronger than I ever imagined." Naomi shook her head, her gaze distant. "I'm not strong. It's Lila. She's the reason I haven't given up." James glanced at Lila, sleeping soundly, and nodded. "She's a miracle. But you, Naomi, you nurtured that strength in her." Naomi smiled, her eyes tender, as she looked at her daughter. "I just want Lila to have a better life than I did," she said. "I used to dream of being an artist, painting big canvases of the sea and sky. But when my mom died, I had to become a nurse to survive. I don't regret it because that job gave me Lila. But sometimes I wonder if I could have given her more." Naomi's calm words carried a deep sadness that made James want to reach out and touch her, though he held back. "What happened to your mom?" James asked gently. Naomi sighed, her gaze drifting to the window where city lights twinkled. "She had cancer too when I was young. We had no money, no insurance. The public hospital did what they could, but it wasn't enough. She died in a room like the one at Mercy Clinic. I became a nurse because I wanted to help people like her, but I am now in the same situation." Naomi paused, looking at James. "Until you came along. You changed everything." James shook his head. "Lila did that. She walked into my office and I couldn't turn away." Naomi smiled, her eyes brightening. "But you chose to stay, James. Not everyone would." Her words touched him, reminding him of the years he'd spent fleeing his impoverished past, building an empire to hide his pain. He'd never shared that with anyone, but with Naomi, he felt he could. "I grew up poor," he said, his voice low. "My mom worked double shifts to raise me and my sister. I built everything to prove I wasn't that boy anymore. But you and Lila, you've made me see that running isn't the answer." Naomi listened, her eyes full of empathy. "You're not running anymore, James. You're here." She reached out her frail fingers, brushing his hand, and in that moment, James felt his heart race. Naomi's light touch was like a current awakening a part of him he thought had long died. He took her hand carefully, as if afraid to hurt her. "Naomi," he said, his voice low, "you make me want to be a better man." Naomi smiled, her eyes shimmering. "You're already a good man, James. You didn't see it." She paused, then said, her voice soft but sincere, "You've given me hope, not just to live, but to love again." Her words were a sweet blade cutting through the armor James had built around his heart. He looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes, and realized he felt the same, a love blossoming not just from gratitude, but from a deep connection between two people who had lost so much. Ruth, the dedicated nurse, entered with a tray of medications. She sensed the special atmosphere between James and Naomi and smiled discreetly. "Naomi, time for your meds," Ruth said gently. Naomi nodded, but her eyes lingered on James. Ruth turned to him, speaking softly. "She's stronger than she thinks, but she needs people like you to remind her." James nodded, grateful for Ruth's presence. She wasn't just a nurse. She was part of this story, someone who understood the value of staying. As Ruth left, Lila stirred, rubbing her eyes and yawning. "I dreamed Mom was painting," she said, climbing onto the bed beside Naomi. Naomi stroked her daughter's head, her eyes full of love. "I'll paint again, sweetheart," she said, "when I'm stronger." Lila looked at James, her eyes bright. "You'll be here when Mom paints, right?" James smiled, nodding. "I'll be here, Lila." She handed him a paper crane, saying, "This is for you. It brings luck." James took it, feeling the warmth spread through him. Marcus, the social worker, stopped by to update them. He met James in the hallway, his eyes hopeful. "Naomi's doing well," Marcus said. "But I have to say, Mr. Whitaker, what you've done for them. It's not just changing their lives. It's making me believe there are still people willing to fight this system." James listened, realizing Naomi and Lila's story wasn't just personal. It was part of a larger issue he could impact with his power and resources. "I'm learning," James replied, his voice low. "Learning to do more." Back in the room, James sat beside Naomi, watching her and Lila talk. Naomi shared a story about painting a sun on their old apartment wall, making Lila giggle uncontrollably. James listened, feeling himself falling into a new world, where love, though simple, was stronger than any contract he'd signed. As Lila drifted back to sleep, Naomi looked at James, her eyes sincere. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, "but for the first time, I want to believe it'll be beautiful. Because of you." James took her hand, his voice soft. "I want to believe that too, Naomi. And I want to be there with you and Lila." The room fell silent, save for Lila's steady breathing and the rhythmic beeps of Naomi's monitor. James sat there, still holding Naomi's hand, and realized he wasn't just helping a family. He was finding a home, not in a glass tower, but in the hearts of two people who had changed him forever. Morning light flooded Naomi Jackson's room at St. Luke's Hospital, illuminating Lila Jackson's paper drawings taped to the walls, innocent images of the sun, trees, and three people holding hands. Naomi, now able to sit up for longer, looked healthier than she had days ago. Her dark skin had regained a hint of color, and her deep brown eyes sparkled with renewed vitality. She held a warm cup of tea, her gentle gaze following Lila, the 6-year-old in a red sweater, who sat on the floor, drawing a new picture with colored pencils. Lila's clear laughter rang out as she described an imaginary cat in her drawing, making Naomi chuckle, a sound James Whitaker, standing near the door, felt was a precious gift. James looked more relaxed than ever, in a white shirt without a tie. He had spent nearly the entire week at the hospital, leaving only to handle urgent company matters. These days, the world of shareholder meetings and billion-dollar deals seemed distant, replaced by the simple but meaningful moments with Naomi and Lila. He stepped into the room, holding a paper bag from the familiar bakery, carrying the scent of fresh bread and pastries Lila loved. "Who wants chocolate pastries?" he asked, his low voice tinged with playfulness. Lila looked up instantly, her eyes gleaming. "Me!" she cried, running to hug James's leg. Naomi laughed, her gaze meeting his with a warmth that made his heart race. "Lila, you've turned Mr. Whitaker into the pastry delivery man," Naomi said, her voice hoarse but cheerful. James sat beside the bed, handing the bag to Lila, who quickly picked a chocolate pastry and returned to her drawing. He looked at Naomi, noticing she seemed stronger each day. The doctors reported that she responded well to the new immunotherapy, though recovery was still long. But to James, every smile from her, every moment she spoke with Lila, was a victory. "You look better," he said softly. Naomi smiled, her eyes filled with deep gratitude. "Thanks to you," she replied. "And Lila. She wouldn't let me give up." James shook his head. "You're the strongest one here, Naomi. Lila just learned from you." Naomi laughed, but her eyes held a trace of sadness. "I wasn't always strong. There were days I thought I wouldn't make it, that Lila would grow up alone. But then you showed up and I started to believe things could be different." Naomi's words, though simple, touched James deeply. He reached out his fingers, gently brushing hers, feeling a warmth spread through him. "You're not alone anymore," he said, his voice low. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Naomi took his hand, her eyes shimmering, and in that moment, James felt a love growing, rooted in gratitude, mutual understanding, and respect. Ruth, the dedicated nurse, entered with a tray of medications. She smiled at Lila, who was nibbling her pastry, her mouth smudged with chocolate. "Little one, you're making the whole room smell like chocolate," Ruth teased. Lila giggled, offering Ruth a piece. "Try some." Ruth took it, her gaze shifting to Naomi and James, sensing their closeness. "Naomi, you're making me jealous," Ruth said playfully. "Having Mr. Whitaker bring pastries every day." Naomi laughed, her cheeks flushing. "I'm lucky," she replied, her eyes meeting James's. Ruth nodded, her expression respectful. "You're both lucky," she said, then left to give them privacy. As Lila returned to her drawing, Naomi shared an old memory with James. "When Lila was 2, I painted a big mural on our apartment wall, a field of flowers under moonlight. Lila would point at it and laugh all day. If I get better, I want to paint again for her." James listened, picturing Naomi with a paintbrush, and realized she wasn't just a nurse or a mother. She was an artist, a woman whose dreams life had put on hold. "You will paint," he said firmly. "And I want to see that mural." Naomi smiled, her eyes bright with hope. "Promise you'll come see it?" she asked. James nodded. "I promise." James had already begun planning for Naomi and Lila's future. He'd arranged a cozy apartment near Lincoln Park where Lila could play and Naomi could recover in a warm space. The apartment had a small room for Lila, a drawing table and bookshelf, and a balcony overlooking greenery, a place James hoped would become their home. He hadn't told Naomi yet, wanting to wait until she was strong enough to leave the hospital. But each time he thought of the apartment, he envisioned a new life where he wasn't just their helper, but part of their family. Marcus, the social worker, stopped by to update them on support procedures for Naomi and Lila. He met James in the hallway, his eyes full of gratitude. "Naomi's progressing beyond expectations," Marcus said. "But I want to say, Mr. Whitaker, what you're doing. It's not just money. You've given them a chance to live again. I've seen too many families like them crushed by the system. You make me believe there's still hope." James listened, recognizing that Marcus's story about his mother was a key part of this journey. "I'm learning to do more," James replied. "Not just for Naomi and Lila, but for others like them." Marcus nodded, his eyes brightening. "If you need my help, I'm here." Back in the room, James saw Lila had finished her new drawing. She ran to him, handing it over with a radiant smile. "This is our house," she said, pointing to a red-roofed home, a field of flowers, and 3 figures at the door: a woman, a girl, and a man in a suit. James took the drawing, his throat tightening. "Our house," he repeated, his gaze meeting Naomi's. She smiled, her eyes conveying deep understanding. "Yes," she said softly. "When I'm better, we'll make it real." James sat beside Naomi, still holding the drawing. Lila climbed onto the bed, snuggling beside her mother, and began talking about her imaginary cats. James listened, feeling himself blend into a new world where love and connection were everything. He looked at Naomi, watching her laugh with Lila, and realized he didn't just want to save her. He wanted to be with her, with Lila, and build a life he'd never dared dream of. As the sunset bathed the room in golden light, James took Naomi's hand, and she squeezed back, their fingers interlocking. In that moment, they weren't just strangers, brought together by fate. They were a new family, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The early morning light filtered through the large windows of St. Luke's Hospital, illuminating Naomi Jackson's room, where Lila Jackson's paper drawings adorned the walls like vibrant accents. Naomi, now able to sit up for extended periods and even take a few steps with assistance, looked more radiant than ever. Her dark skin had regained a healthy glow, and her deep brown eyes sparkled as she watched Lila, the 6-year-old, in a red sweater, folding a new paper crane. Lila chattered about a dream where she and her mother soared across a starry sky, her clear voice ringing like a melody of hope. Standing near the door with a familiar bakery bag, James Whitaker smiled at Lila's story, his heart swelling with a feeling he'd never known belonging. James stepped inside, placing the bag on the table beside Naomi's bed. "Waffles today," he said, his low voice laced with cheer. Lila's head snapped up, her eyes gleaming. "I love waffles," she squealed, rushing to hug James's leg. Naomi laughed, her gaze meeting his, with a tenderness that felt like home. "You're spoiling her," Naomi said, her voice hoarse but warm. James sat beside her, handing Lila a waffle, then turned to Naomi. "You look stronger every day," he said sincerely. Naomi nodded, fiddling with Lila's paper crane. "I feel like I'm returning to life," she replied. "Because of you, James." "And Lila." James shook his head. "You and Lila brought me to life," he said, his eyes locked on hers. Over the past few days, their bond had deepened, transcending gratitude or admiration, to become a profound love built on shared moments and mutual understanding. James had once believed his life had room only for work and power, but Naomi and Lila had opened a new world where love was the center of everything. He took Naomi's hand, their fingers intertwining, and she returned a smile that lit up the room. Ruth, the devoted nurse, entered with a tray of medications, her eyes twinkling at the sight of this little family. "Naomi, that smile's making the whole hospital jealous," Ruth teased. Lila giggled, offering Ruth a paper crane. "Keep this. It's for luck." Ruth took it, ruffling Lila's hair. "I'll treasure it, sweetheart." She turned to James, her expression respectful. "Mr. Whitaker, the doctors say Naomi could move to a recovery room in a few days. That's good news." James nodded, a wave of hope rising within him. "Thank you, Ruth," he said. "You've done so much for them." Ruth smiled. Naomi did a lot for me. This is my way of giving back. As Ruth left Marcus, the social worker arrived to discuss Naomi and Lila's future. He met James and Naomi in a corner of the room while Lila drew on the floor. Naomi, you're making incredible progress, Marcus said, his voice hopeful. But we need to talk about the next steps. When you're discharged, you and Lila will need a stable place to live and possibly financial support until you're strong enough to work again. Naomi nodded, her eyes flickering with worry. I don't want to depend on anyone, she said. I want to stand on my own. James placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice firm. You will, Naomi. But for now, let me help. Marcus looked at James, his gaze carrying deep sincerity. Mr. Whitaker, I need to ask something important, he said. If for any reason Naomi can't care for Lila, would you be willing to become her legal guardian? Marcus's question hung like a cold breeze, silencing Naomi and James. Naomi glanced at Lila, her eyes filled with love, but also concern. James didn't hesitate. Yes, he said, his voice low, but resolute. I want to be there for them no matter what. Naomi turned to him, her eyes glistening. James, she whispered, you don't have to. James squeezed her hand tighter. I want to, he replied. You and Lila are my family. Lila, hearing her name, looked up from her drawing. What's a family? She asked, her eyes curious. Naomi smiled, pulling Lila onto the bed. A family is people who love and stay with each other, no matter what, she said. Lila nodded, then looked at James. So you're my family, right? James smiled, his throat tightening. Yes, Lila, he replied. And I'll always be here. Lila hugged him, and Naomi watched them, her eyes brimming with emotion. Thank you, she said, her voice choked, for giving us a family. James had already begun making their family a reality. He finalized arrangements for the apartment near Lincoln Park, with a drawing room for Lila and a bright space for Naomi's recovery. He also contacted his company's charitable foundation to establish a fund for uninsured patients, inspired by Naomi's story. Marcus, hearing about the plan, nodded in approval. You're doing what this system needs, he said. Not just for Naomi and Lila, but for thousands of others. James listened, realizing this story was about more than one family creating broader change. That evening, James, Naomi, and Lila shared a simple dinner in the hospital room. Sandwiches and juice from the cafeteria warmed in a microwave. Lila told funny stories about her imaginary cat, making Naomi and James laugh. Ruth, passing by, paused and smiled. I've never seen this room so happy, she said. You all make me believe in good things. James looked at Naomi and Lila, feeling this wasn't just a meal. It was a promise of a shared life, facing every challenge together. As Lila drifted off to sleep in the chair, Naomi took James's hand, her eyes sincere. I know I don't have much to give you, she said. But I want to give you everything I have, my heart, and Lila. James leaned in, kissing her forehead gently, his voice soft. You've given me more than you know, Naomi. You and Lila are all I need. Naomi smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. And at that moment, they were more than two people brought together by fate. They were a family ready to embark on a new journey. The sunset draped Chicago in a radiant golden glow, reflecting off skyscrapers and filtering through the windows of the new apartment near Lincoln Park. With its bright white walls and warm wooden floors, the apartment was the gift James Whitaker had quietly prepared for Naomi Jackson and Lila Jackson. Today marked Naomi's official discharge from St. Luke's Hospital after nearly 2 weeks of intensive treatment, and James wanted to commemorate this moment with a fresh start. In the living room, Lila, the 6-year-old black girl, now wearing a sun-printed t-shirt instead of her red sweater, darted around pointing at her drawings hung on the walls. "Mom, look!" she exclaimed, gesturing to a picture of 3 people in front of a house. "This is our home." Standing by the balcony door, Naomi turned and smiled at her daughter. She looked remarkably stronger, her curly black hair tied high, her skin glowing with a healthy hue. Though she still needed further recovery, Naomi could now walk unaided, and her voice had regained its familiar warmth. Dressed in a light cotton dress, her eyes sparkled as she watched Lila, then shifted to James, who stood near the kitchen arranging a simple dinner. "Lila, you've turned the whole apartment into an art gallery," Naomi said, her tone teasing. James chuckled, stepping closer with a plate of sandwiches. "I love this gallery," he said, his gaze locked on Naomi's. "It makes this place a home." Lila ran over, hugging James's leg. "You're staying with us, right?" she asked, her eyes shining. James knelt at her level. "Yes, Lila," he replied, his voice low but firm. "I'm not going anywhere." Naomi watched them, her eyes brimming with emotion. She stepped closer, placing a hand on Lila's shoulder, and said, "We're so lucky, sweetheart. Mr. Whitaker is our family." Lila nodded, then dashed off to grab another drawing to show off. James took Naomi's hand, their fingers intertwining, and she leaned her head on his shoulder. At that moment, under the sunset's glow, they were more than people brought together by fate. They were a family ready to begin a new life. The journey to this moment hadn't been easy. Just 2 weeks ago, Naomi lay in a Mercy clinic room, battling late-stage lung cancer. With courage far beyond her 6 years, Lila, a CEO, immersed in a world of power, had walked into James's office and changed everything. James, who once believed his life was only for work, found new meaning through his love for Naomi and Lila. He covered Naomi's treatment costs and arranged this apartment complete with a drawing room for Lila and a bright space for Naomi's recovery. Beyond that, he established a fund through his company to support uninsured patients like Naomi, inspired by their story. Ruth, the devoted nurse from Mercy Clinic, stopped by to celebrate Naomi's discharge. She brought a box of homemade cookies, her eyes twinkling as she watched Lila scamper. "Naomi, you make me proud," Ruth said, hugging her friend. "And Mr. Whitaker, you've done what an entire hospital couldn't imagine." James shook his head, smiling. "I just did what Lila asked," he replied. Ruth laughed. "That girl is a miracle. And you too?" She looked at Naomi. "And James are proof that love can change everything." Naomi squeezed Ruth's hand, her eyes full of gratitude. "You were there from the start, Ruth. I'll never forget that." Marcus, the social worker, also visited, bringing a small bouquet. He shook James's hand, his gaze filled with respect. "Mr. Whitaker, your fund is already helping other patients," he said. "I just got word that a family from Mercy Clinic will be transferred to St. Luke's because of you." James nodded, feeling a satisfaction unlike any from his billion-dollar deals. "Thank you, Marcus," he said. "I wouldn't know where to start without you." Marcus smiled. "We're a team, Mr. Whitaker, and this team is making a difference." After Ruth and Marcus left, James, Naomi, and Lila gathered around the dining table, enjoying dinner sandwiches, salad, and apple juice. Lila shared tales of an imaginary cat living on the roof, making Naomi and James laugh. "I'll draw it for you, Mom," Lila said, running to grab her colored pencils. Naomi looked at James, her eyes tender. "I never thought I'd have a day like this," she said. "A home, a family, a future." James took her hand in a low voice. "Neither did I, Naomi. But now I can't imagine life without you and Lila." Naomi shared her dream of opening a small art studio where she and Lila could create. I want Lila to grow up knowing she can chase her dreams, she said. James listened, envisioning a future where he stood by Naomi cheering her and Lila on. You'll do it, he said, and I'll be there helping make it real. Naomi smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. You've made me believe in dreams again, she whispered. Lila returned, handing James and Naomi a new drawing, a red-roofed house, a field of flowers, and 3 people at the door holding hands. This is us, forever, Lila said, her eyes gleaming. James took the drawing, his throat tightening. Forever, he echoed, his gaze meeting Naomi's. She nodded, tears shimmering in her eyes. Forever, she said. Lila climbed onto her mother's lap, hugging them both, and in that moment, the small apartment became the center of their world. Outside the window, Chicago pulsed with its frenetic pace. But time seemed to slow in this apartment. James looked at Naomi and Lila, realizing he'd found home not in glass towers or billion-dollar contracts, but in the love, connection, and courage of a girl who changed him forever. Lila, with her handwritten resume and big heart, hadn't just saved her mother. She'd saved James, pulling him from loneliness and giving him a reason to live. Their story didn't end here. Naomi would continue her recovery. Lila would grow up with boundless dreams, and James would fight to reform an unjust healthcare system, starting with his fund. But at this moment, under the sunset's glow, they had everything they needed: a family, a home, and a love strong enough to overcome any challenge. James hugged Naomi and Lila, whispering, "Thank you both for giving me a new beginning." Lila looked up, smiling. "Thank you for staying," she said. And Naomi, with a smile bright as the sun, added, "Thank you for loving us." They sat together under Chicago's first evening stars, a new family ready for the days ahead. This story, sparked by a handwritten resume, had become a testament that love through action, commitment, and courage can transform not just one life, but an entire world.